this is work that I did with Laker Newhouse, who's also on this call. Laker is was a student at Khan Lab School. He's now starting as a freshman at MIT. So Laker's on the call, and he can also answer any questions during the questioning period. So this is a project we did together. I'm a DEI ambassador for Informs, and the project I looked at was diversity in the Informs Journal editorial boards. So a little bit of background. Any of us who are academics know very well that if you want to be successful, you have to publish in respected scholarly journals. But if journal editorial boards really don't reflect the diversity of thought in a field, then work that maybe is new, interesting, innovative, worthy might be overlooked. So there's been a bit of a groundswell of movement about journal editorial boards. I read a critique of scientific journals from a number of computer scientists, I think, who wanted to have much more open access publishing. And what they said is a handful of gatekeepers limit the flow of information. So our study looked at, well, who are the gatekeepers for the Informs journals? And in particular, as I'll describe in more detail in a few minutes, diversity among our so-called gatekeepers. So we examined diversity in the Informs Journal editorial boards, and we think of diversity in two ways: diversity of people and diversity of ideas, right? So diversity of people, man, woman, ethnicity, whatever, and diversity of ideas, different viewpoints. And I'll explain how we measured those in a bit. Now, it's important to note that these factors are related, but not the same, right? So people who are diverse, if you have a diverse set of individuals, they're likely to have a diversity of viewpoints. But on the other hand, you could have individuals who are demographically similar, and they can also have diverse viewpoints. So certainly when we think about diversity of ideas, we don't have perfect metrics. But let me tell you a little bit about past work that's been done on diversity in journal editorial boards. Until I started this study, I didn't even know that people had started to examine this issue. But for example, there's a long history of research showing that diversity of people leads to advances in science, engineering, and medicine. An article in 2014 in Scientific American stated that decades of research by organizational scientists, psychologists, sociologists, economists, and demographers show that socially diverse groups, that is, those with a diversity of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, are more innovative than homogeneous groups. A number of studies have examined diversity in journal editorial boards, although most of the studies that I was able to find focused just on how many women were on the editorial boards. So, for example, a recent study done by some scholars at Cornell said that poor representation of women among the scientific gatekeepers is likely to reduce the diversity of ideas, perspectives, and values that make it to print. Increased representation of women might change which type of manuscripts are accepted for publication, which areas are identified as worthy of invited reviews, which papers are selected to be highlighted by commentaries, and who is chosen to write these commentary and perspective pieces. Another study of the representation of women in management journals said the persistent gender imbalance in the editorial boards of many management journals in the last 15 years hinders women's ability to attain scholarly recognition and advancement, and carries the risk of narrowing the nature and scope of inquiry in management. So these are a few studies about women on editorial boards. More broadly, the Association for Information Systems has come out with a recommendation that the editorial boards of key journals in which their members publish should really reflect and represent the diversity of the membership of the Association for Information Systems. And their statement about this is, by doing this, this will communicate or signal a commitment of fairness to all submitters. And finally, I came upon a study of the peer review process for the United Kingdom Science and Engineering Council. So they commissioned a study to see how fair the peer review process was. And they came up with one interesting finding that I thought was quite relevant to what we were investigating. And that is when peer reviewers have similar views, and they call it cognitive cronyism, then worthy work might be overlooked in areas for which there's no scientific consensus. So a variety of studies have examined different aspects of diversity in journal editorial boards and the peer review process. So let me tell you about what we did in our study. So for each of the 16 Informs journals, we examined the editors. It turns out there are 499 editors, which correspond to 460 unique individuals, because some people serve on multiple boards. And we looked at the journals as of July 2020, so about a year ago. So Laker did a Google Scholar scrape and wrote some custom Python code to get information that we wanted. So we did two things. First, we did statistical analysis of demographic factors. So for each journal, we wanted to know how many women were on the editorial board, how many underrepresented minorities. And we use this definition according from the US government, which was African American or Black, Mexican American, Native American, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and I didn't put it down, or biracial with two or more groupings from this list. So that's how we defined underrepresented minorities. And we also looked at the home institution of each person. So we're looking kind of at different aspects of demographic diversity of the editors. But then I mentioned that we're also trying to think about diversity of ideas or viewpoints. So here we use co-author relationships. So our thinking is if people have written papers together, then they may have somewhat similar viewpoints. So we wanted to know how many of the editors have written papers with the other editors. So Laker did a Google Scholar scrape and did a network analysis to identify co-author relationships. He looked at basically published papers of individuals who are editorial board members. Now, of course, like journals often have things like acknowledgements and thanking the referees. We didn't want to pick that up. This is an automated scraping. And mind you, we have 460 unique individuals who've written collectively thousands and thousands of papers. So it had to be automated. So he excluded papers with more than 6 authors, excluded editorials, acknowledgements, et cetera, as best we could, and excluded any papers written before 1980. So he did a network analysis and then network visualization for each journal. What are the co-author relationships? So these are our methods. So what did we find out? So first, our demographic analysis, looking at women and underrepresented minorities. So women comprise just under 20% of the Informs Journal editorial board members. To put this into, and so these are for the different journals. We have an article that has just appeared in Articles in Advance for Service Science that has all the details here. So I've just put numbers because it's easier than putting the journal name in. But so if we look at the fraction of women in the journals, the highest was organization science, which was a little bit more than 45%. The lowest was stochastic systems, which was like, I think 7%. So a real range of women on the editorial boards. And the average was about 20%. And to put this into context, 26.3% of Informs members are women. So fewer women on the editorial boards than are Informs members. Number of underrepresented minorities. We did a manual search looking at every single person's name and who they were to identify who on the editorial boards was an underrepresented minority as defined, which as I mentioned, according to this definition, we found 3 people. So that's less than 1%. It was 3 individuals. Now, interestingly, Gina Lloyd gave me this recent data. Among Informs members who recently identified their race or ethnicity, 1% I rounded these numbers, 1% identified as being Black and 2.7% identified as being Hispanic or Latinx. So a lower representation of underrepresented minorities than in our professional society. And I might mention also that more broadly, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that in US STEM professions, 7% of people in the workforce are Black and 13.2% are Hispanic or Latinx. So lower numbers of women and underrepresented minorities than are in our professional society. This is data. This just gives you an idea of the kind of demographic data that we collected. So for each of our 16 journals written in alphabetical order, we've put down how many issues are published as of July 2020. I think there may have been some changes since then. How many papers were published last year by those journals? We looked at the year of the PhD of the editor-in-chief, and then the total number of editors, the number of women editors, number of underrepresented minorities. And here we have 4 because one person serves on 2 journals. The number of editor institutions and the average number of editors per institution. So this is the kind of demographic data that we collected. Now looking at institutional diversity. So 10 institutions, which is less than 5% of the total institutions of the 460 individuals, account for more than 1/4 of the editors. So here are the top 10 institutions according to the number of editors that are from that institution. So like your heavy hitters, Columbia, my institution, Stanford, Cornell, Pennsylvania, MIT, USC, etc. So these are the top 10 institutions. Now, of course, one would argue that the institutions that value scholarship, graduation of PhDs, and service to the communities, of course, they would naturally have more people who were interested in and available to become editorial board members. The question really is, have we achieved the right balance? So 10% of institutions, less than 5% of the total, account for more than 1/4 of the editors. Now, I mentioned we also did a network analysis to identify connectivity, that is, who wrote a paper with whom. And what we found out, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute, is some of the Informs journals have quite low levels of connectivity between board members, and some do not. So, for example, this is a network visualization. So this is figure 3A from the paper. This is a network visualization of the Informs journal on applied analytics. Now, the dots represent editors. I use red to represent the editor-in-chief. Well, Laker did, used red to represent the editor-in-chief, and blue is the other editors. And so if there is a link between 2 people, it means they have published a paper together since 1980. So you can see, if you look at the Informs Journal on Applied Analytics, there's not a lot of co-authorship between the journal editors. Another example of a journal that didn't have much connectivity. And the average degree of this network was 0.8, which means that on average, each editor had written 0.8 papers with another editor. Another journal that had pretty low connectivity was a journal, Operations Research. So here's the network for Operations Research. There's some people who've written papers together, and then a whole bunch of other people who have not written papers with anyone. For Operations Research, the average degree was also 0.8. So these are journals with low levels of connectivity. However, we also found that some of the journals actually had rather, in my opinion, rather startlingly high levels of connectivity. So here's the journal, Marketing Science. Again, same idea, editor-in-chief in red, all the editors, the other editors shown as blue, and the lines indicate a relationship. We made some networks where we showed the strength of the relationship, like how many papers, but that was just too much information. So This is just a simple version. So in marketing science, the average editor has written a paper with 3.1 other editors. Another example of a highly connected network was the journal Manufacturing and Service Operations Management. You can see this network kind of looks like a hairball or something, right? A thicket of relationships. For MSOM, the average degree was 4.4. The average editor had written a paper with 4.4 other editors. So a real mix of connectivity in the journal. Some had quite low connectivity and some had rather high connectivity. We also looked, for example, if let's say we take the journal, two journals that are kind of similar. And so Laker here has done operations research and management science. So operations research editors are shown in blue, the management science editors are shown in green, the two editors in chief are shown in red. So some connections, but what is interesting here, we thought, is that the editors of management science tended to publish more with other editors of management science. Editors of operations research tend to publish more with editors from their own journal. And we also did that for operations research and stochastic systems, perhaps because these two fields are well, stochastic systems in a way is kind of a subset of a lot of what operations research does, a little bit more interconnected when you consider the two journals. So a range of connectivity from low to high. Across all the journals, the average editor degree was 2.1. So across all the Inform's editorial boards, the average editor wrote a paper with 2.1 other editors. And this degree ranged from 0.5, so very low, the Inform's transactions on education, to 4.4, manufacturing and service operations management. Now, this is also interesting. We looked at the maximum editor degree for any editor on an editorial board. How many papers did you write? What was the maximum of anyone? So the Inform's transactions on education, one person had written a paper with two of the other editors. But for manufacturing and service operations management, one editor had written papers with 19 of the other editors. So a lot of interconnection there. We also looked at the editor degree for males and females. The average editor degree was 2.2 for males and 1.9 for females. Although I believe that for approximately half the journals, the women editors had a slightly higher average degree, like for 5 of the 16 journals or 6 of the 16, something like that. And for the others, the males had higher. So it was a little bit mixed. For almost all of the journals, the editor-in-chief had a higher degree than average. I suppose that's not surprising because editors-in-chief tend to appoint people with whom they are acquainted. And sometimes acquainted means former student, you colleague, wrote a paper with them, whatever. So connectivity ranged a lot. Now, when I talked about average degree is affected by the number of network nodes. If you have a lot of nodes in the network, you have more potential to write papers with more people. So we created we calculated a standardized measure, which is edge density. So edge density is a standard network measure that's the fraction of possible connections that appear in the network. So if you think of a network, you could connect every single thing, and then that would have an edge density of 1. You could connect no one, that would have an edge density of 0. So using this standardized measure, the edge density ranged from 0.021 for organization science to 0.164 for strategy science. So what this means is in organization science, 2.1% of the potential connections between the editors were actually seen. For the journal Strategy Science, 16.4% of the connections were there. And again, the connections are co-authorship. For a lot of the journals, the edge density was between 7 and 17%. So 7 to 17% of the potential connections were there. So this shows you the table from our network analysis. So again, each of the 16 journals in alphabetical order, the number of editors, the average degree of the editors of that journal, the average degree of men, the average degree of women, the degree of the editor-in-chief, the maximum degree of any one individual. And then we also looked at isolated nodes and connected components. So isolated nodes is a person who hasn't written a paper with anyone on the editorial board. And connected components, just, I wrote a paper with you, you wrote a paper with that person type of thing. And then here's the edge density. And again, this is all in our paper and you can look at it at leisure. We also then thought about correlations. So, we collected all kinds of demographic data. How does this correlate with other demographic data, with connectivity, et cetera? So we didn't find very many correlations. So for example, we looked at the editor-in-chief's PhD year and we thought, well, is it possible that editors-in-chief who got their PhD a long time ago haven't, appointed many women? That's actually not true. Is editor-in-chief's PhD year related to average editor degree? No. Edge density? No. So we didn't find any correlations there. We also didn't find correlations between basically the variety of institutions represented by the board, which we measure as institutions per board member, and fraction of women on the editorial board or edge density. And similarly, we looked at, is there any kind of correlation between fraction of women on an editorial board and edge density, average editor degree, average degree of male and female editors? No. Really, we found only one statistically significant correlation, and that was between the number of institutions represented by the board members, which we calculate as institutions per board member, and the average editor degree. But other than that, no statistically significant correlations, which probably just says each journal is different. And, each journal evolved in a different way. We also did sensitivity analysis. For example, Laker excluded all papers that were greater than 10 years old. Well, what happened if we just look at recent papers? The results were really unchanged. We excluded a relationship if the people only wrote one paper together. The networks became less dense, but some journals still had fairly connected networks. So these are our findings, that we have lower numbers of women and underrepresented minorities than presumably is represented by our membership. And some of our journals have very high levels of connectivity among the editorial boards as measured by co-authorship. So first of all, of course, our analysis has some limitations. As I mentioned, the 460 editors had collectively written thousands of papers. There's no way we could manually search. So certainly our analysis of co-author relationships has to be limited by the accuracy of the Google Scholar database. In fact, I looked on Google Scholar for myself, and way, way, way down at the bottom, I found a few things that had nothing to do with me. I have no idea, but my name was on them. So, again, it's how accurate the database is. Although for the 16 editors-in-chief, Laker manually looked at their co-authorships. All editors went down a little bit, but all by the same amount, which leads us to think that even if we were to manually do it, we'd still find the relative differences. That is, some journals are just, the editorial board is very interconnected, and some journals they are not. Now, I mentioned that at the beginning that we're using co-author relationship as a proxy for diversity of viewpoints. It's only a proxy, and certainly it's a little bit hard to establish a link between a whole bunch of people who wrote papers with each other. Do they all have the same viewpoint? So it's a proxy. I don't think it's a bad proxy, but it is a proxy. There's other kinds of connections you could think about as well that we did not measure. So advisor, advisee, although presumably they might have written a paper together. Now, another thing, I showed you the definition we used of underrepresented minorities. I believe that for STEM in the United States in colleges, they also include Hispanics from South America. So if we did that and included that in our definition of an underrepresented minority, then we would certainly see more underrepresented minorities counted on the editorial boards. And then, of course, there are lots of ways of thinking about demographic diversity, right? You know, a person's age, their national origin, institution where their highest degree was earned, sexual orientation. There's lots of things you could think about for diversity that we did not measure. But nonetheless, we do think that some of the informed journals have a high level of connectivity, and that we have fewer women and underrepresented minorities on our editorial boards than in our membership. So we came up with the following recommendations for informs journals. First of all, right, the informs committee, that search committee that's looking for an editor-in-chief of one of our journals, should seek a broad pool of potential editor-in-chief candidates. Those candidates they interview should have some kind of diversity plan. They should ask them, you know, how are you thinking about diversity of people, diversity of ideas on your editorial board? New editors-in-chief should review their existing editorial board. Laker and I exchanged emails with, I believe it was the editor of Marketing Science, and he said, I know my journal's connected. I took over this journal and I inherited this set of editors. And of course I'm reviewing it, but it's a slow process to diversify my editorial board. You know, people are appointed for a certain amount of time. So I think editors-in-chief should review their existing editorial boards and then make changes as appropriate over time. Another thought we have is that when an editor-in-chief is thinking of appointing a new editorial board member, they should ask them or find out which other editorial board members have you written papers with, so they have a sense of how connected this person is and whether they want to appoint them. And then finally, we think that editorial board diversity should be reviewed regularly. So these are our recommendations that we gave in our paper, and we also told the Informs Publication Committee. So the conclusions of our study, which I think I've said about 5 times, but I'll say it again. The editorial boards of many of the Informs journals have low levels of diversity in terms of gender and underrepresented minorities, and some have highly connected editorial boards, suggesting really what we call an influence of what we call an in-crowd of like-minded individuals. We think that Informs and the editors-in-chief of its journals can and should work to end this state of affairs. So in sum, what we say is that the Informs journal editorial boards should support a diversity of backgrounds and views, thus enabling the publication of a broader range of ideas and invigorating academic discourse in our profession. So that's the bottom line of our study, what we think. As I mentioned, this paper has appeared in articles in Advanced Service Science, and if you have any trouble downloading it or accessing it, please send me email and I'll happily send you a copy of the paper. Now, areas for further research. So this was the first study in my first year as a DEI ambassador. I'm a DEI ambassador for this year as well, so we're going to continue this work. Here are a few ideas. One is think about, so we talked about institutional diversity of editors. Maybe you could also think about institutional diversity of whose papers published in the journals. You know, is it only certain schools that tend to have papers get accepted? Another thing that was pointed out to us is that not every editor makes acceptance or rejection decisions. So maybe we could focus on just who makes the acceptance and rejection decisions. Another interesting point we could think about is, what about related journals that our members publish in? What about the journal Production and Operations Management? What about the journal Healthcare Management Science? So other journals, how are they doing in terms of diversity? Just to get a sense of how we are doing. And then importantly, here's one thing that we are doing. I have a student doing this right now, which is to update our analysis for the Informs journals. Since we did this study in July 2020, we had 16 journals, and I believe 3 women editors-in-chief. Now we have a new journal. We have 17 journals, and 5 of the 17 editors-in-chief are women. So changes are happening. And I didn't look at statistics of the editorial boards, but so we want to update our analysis and see how we're doing as a society. So that, in a nutshell, is our study. Laker and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brando, for the time and all the awareness you are giving us with all the statistics and the information and the long road we still need to walk to increase DEI in editorial boards. I may maybe take 1 minute and share my screen and share something with all of you. I hope you can see my screen. And then this is something very new, thanks to the efforts from the DEI committee and the Informs team. So now on 16 of the 17 journals, now you can see all the statistics regarding the editorial board diversity. So this is a good start for sure, but as I mentioned before, this is a long journey that we need to walk. So just want to bring this to everyone's attention. I'm going to put it on the chat as well. And then I would like to open the floor for discussions or for questions. So I do see a hand here, Dr. Johnson.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Michael.
Thank you, Margaret, for such a great study. I enjoyed it very much. I wanted to, if I could, clarify a bit some data that I'm familiar with regarding socio-demographic composition of Informs. And this comes from the 2020 paper from Tutorials and Operations Research. And there are a number of sources. One is a 2017 study by 2 authors funded by National Science Foundation. They did a proper survey using statistically valid techniques of a bunch of STEM professional societies, including Informs. And of course, we also have Informs member self-report data. And so these authors reported the NSF study from 2017 that Informs, they estimated, was about 28.5% women, 2.6% Black, and 6.9% Hispanic.
Yeah.
The self-report data that I got from Informs was incomplete because, as you know, there are lots of, there's a large percentage of it choose not to respond. And
Right.
when you limit the data to those who chose a gender category or race ethnicity category, I found about 22% women, 2% Black, and 5% Hispanic. So it appears that representation of Blacks and Hispanics is just a bit higher.
Yes. And I saw that Tutorials and Operations Research paper, and I asked Gina for some self-report data this year. But yes, I agree with you. I think my estimates of what they are is lower than what it really is. Yes.
And if they are lower, then of course that strengthens the evidence for underrepresentation, particularly by African American and Hispanics.
Yes.
I think I have used or I have referred to definitions from the Bureau of the Census, and as you know, they distinguish race categories as distinct from ethnicity categories. But where we're not able to make that distinction, people usually use a broader set of national identifiers, because Latinx people can, of course, come from many countries. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much for everything that you've done.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate that. I see a question in the chat from Anna. I think it's Anna. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Go ahead, Anna.
Hi, thank you so much, Margaret. That was so provocative and so important. And I'm looking forward to many future studies. I know you're really busy, but I think it's really important, especially the connectivity in terms of where the PhDs were granted. I think we would find a lot more connectivity, along that dimension. But given the work involved, okay, and the novelty of it, I was wondering whether you were inspired to do this study because of personal experiences.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily personal experiences, because I feel like in refereeing, you win some, you lose some, but I have heard from many Informs member that XYZ journal and whatever journal is kind of a closed club of the in crowd. They don't even say good old boys, because there might be women, but it's a closed club. And if you don't do XYZ research, they won't publish it. And that's kind of what inspired me. And I will say, I'm not going to name journals, and you can read our paper, but I will say that journals that people had told me they thought were kind of closed clubs were the journals that we did find that editors had all written papers with each other. That's loosely speaking. Of course, they hadn't all, but so the anecdotal evidence was borne out by the study. And our view is, anecdotes are all very nice, but we want to see the numbers. You may have an opinion, but I really want to know, okay, well, who did write papers with whom? And is this journal, closed in like you say or not? But at least for a couple of the journals that people have mentioned to me as being very, very, I'm not sure what the word is, inbred, but closed to the kinds of things they think are important. Indeed, there was a lot of co-author connection.
And thank you for emphasizing diversity of ideas. I think that's fundamental and really, really important. So
Yes.
Thank you.
And again, it's really hard to know exactly what is diversity of ideas. And as I mentioned, people who are demographically similar could have very different ideas. I mean, I know I work with people at Stanford. Well, they're from other departments like the med school or whatever, who have very different ways of thinking than I do. And it's great. Anyway.
We see a question, I think, on the chat. Someone raised their hand first, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I have my hand raised. Hi, my name is Juhi Ramaprasad. I'm an information systems professor at University of Maryland. Thank you so much for this. It was super interesting to see kind of what we all are thinking kind of in numbers. And I really appreciate it. I've read the paper and I really appreciated that. You mentioned in your talk that you had an interaction with the marketing science editor-in-chief. And I'm curious if, and I'm not sure if you're comfortable sharing or not, but I guess let me premise this with, I've tried to have some of these conversations showing some data to make change. And I see a barrier between showing the data and showing kind of what's out there and actually inviting change, right? People in charge of being willing to change. So I'm wondering if you had any other interactions where this really kind of started motivating different kind of, I know it's a marathon, right? I just was in another talk about diversity. It's a marathon, not a sprint, but I'm wondering if you see a sense that this is actually, moving the needle. It would be great if it is. Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to say is when we did this work, we sent it to a lot of people. So David Simke-Levy was kind of interested in this topic. I think it started, I mean, I'm sure he's always interested, but it started because someone complained about how their paper was reviewed. And they thought that a review was racist on some point, not fully racist, but racist on some point. And David thought, well, I don't like this. I don't want this to happen in my journal. And I should think more broadly about diversity. And so he had actually said, emailed me and said, I hear that you're doing a study, love to find out what you're doing. But then it kind of made us realize that as we're going along, we should talk to lots of people, lots of journal editors. So I talked to Chris Tang at MSOM, talked to John Burge, and then we presented our work to the Informs Publication Committee at the Informs meeting last autumn. And that was when the marketing science editor, I guess I'd shown that thing, and he contacted us and very nicely said, I recognize this. So so far, the people that we've spoken with are people who've said, I really would like my journal to improve. And so what can I do? So I can't speak for all editors because I don't know them all and haven't personally talked to all of them. And then, of course, the editor of Service Science is very interested and asked us to send our paper there. So I can't speak for all editors, but I think at least the ones I've spoken with are interested and in looking at this topic and thinking about what we can do. Now, how quickly change comes, I don't know.
Of course. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd be interested to see what happens as other editors read your paper as well. So thanks a lot for that.
One other point, could we possibly make your fantastic paper open source? I think it's if we should do that.
Well, that's probably up to Informs, but I'm
We'll advocate.
I'm certainly sending it to anyone who wants.
Yeah.
We'll look into that.
And if you have it, you guys can send it to anyone you want.
I actually paid for it to get it, to read it.
Oh, Anna, no.
I did. I thought it was important enough. I'm not going to the movies now, so.
Anna, you could always ask us for that.
No,
but
no,
Margaret,
no. I thought
this
it
was-
was so important, so.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'll take that as an action item to talk with Matt Walls to see if how that works.
Especially because scientifically it's one of the first. So I think, in terms of PR potential for Informs, I think it's fantastic.
Well, Laker and I did a pretty exhaustive review of the literature, and we're fairly sure that nobody has done a network analysis like we did. So I think that is the most novel thing we have here. Oh, and Laker has just put in the chat, we've also made our code publicly available on GitHub. So if people want to, and in fact, the editor of which journal, Laker? Of another journal emailed us and is doing it for his journal, not an Informs journal.
Oh, it was, I believe from China, actually.
No, but it was not a Chinese journal. It was like
MISQ. Sorry,
I
was it
remember.
MISQ by any chance?
Would that
Andrew
be
Burton
great?
Jones.
yes.
Yeah. And I'm working with him on actually diversity in the review process. And yeah. So
Oh,
Andrew
okay.
Burton Jones is super interested in this. Yeah, that's at MISQ.
Looks like Michael has his hand raised.
So, Margaret, I'm interested in drawing a connection between journal editorial board diversity and breadth of ideas as published in the journals. That is probably really hard to get at, but maybe one entry point could be the 2019 Editor's Cut on diversity, which tried to survey the landscape and found, confirming your work, significant representation of papers from organization science that we thought had some DEI content. I'm a diversity ambassador this year, working with a colleague trying to sort of quantify presence of DEI content in Informs published journals. But I think that it might be worthwhile to ask ourselves exactly how might we expect greater diversity in editorial boards to manifest itself in changes in content and topic coverage, methods used, etc. I haven't seen anybody write on that, at least in our field.
Right. And I mean, I think the answer to that is you have to appoint editors with very different viewpoints, right? So if you're the editor of management science, I'm just winging it here and I'm no critique on David at all, but let's say you're editor of a broad management journal, you want empirical people, you want theoretical people, you want economists, you want very different people. I won't embarrass Laker too much here, but his grandfather is a famous professor, a famous economics professor at Harvard. And his grandfather, I believe, founded the journal Health economics or I think it's health economics. And or he was certainly editor-in-chief of it. And so I asked him, well, how did you think about diversity? He said, Margaret, it was a new field and I just had to pick people who knew the different topics I needed. So there's an element of that, that you just got to pick people who know the topics. So I think for us, for diversity moving forward and diversity of ideas, the editorial board should not be all people who do the same thing and have this PhD from the same school and are so closely related. That's my vague answer. Okay, right. It's not a precise scientific answer, but your point is very well taken, Michael. Yeah, I agree.
I think we have also a question on the chat from Roy. Roy, you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so one thing that I remember from your slides was that Art Science as a journal was doing a comparatively much better job in terms of the representation of women in their editorial board. So are you aware of any best practices that other informed journals could potentially replicate to improve, let's say, the diversity in their editorial boards as such?
Well, first of all, I think that's slightly an artifact of the fact that the organization science field has many, many more women in it than some of the other fields. So I haven't investigated any further than that, but it's certainly true that field, there are many more women. If you go to an organization science type conference, many, many women. It's like I go to health policy and medical conferences, there are women, at least half the people there. So I don't know the answer to your question. So that specific journal, I don't know. I would think that if you had a woman editor-in-chief, that would change. So we have some new women editors-in-chief taking over. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Okay, thank you.
So I don't know the answer.
Thanks.
Anyone else has more questions or you want to put them on the chat? I have a question. So the average degree significantly changed among journals. Do you have any insights on why this is happening? Does the highest average degree comes from those journals that are older? Or is there any reason, or particular reason why we see from 0.8 to I think more than 2 or 3 on the average degree of connectivity?
Actually, it's 4.4 for
4.4. Okay.
No, I think that say manufacturing and service operations management, that seems to be a pretty narrowly defined field where everyone's written a paper with everybody else. That's a very loose statement, but where there's a lot of interconnectedness. Whereas I think Inform's Journal on Applied Analytics, that is the people on the editorial board or just anyone who's interested in how we can apply analytics. So it tends to be a much more open type of field, maybe. So that could be one reason that manufacturing and service operations management is a very tightly defined field. I'm only speculating. I don't know the answer. And I'd welcome anyone else's thoughts on this.
One other factor is that larger journals simply have more people that are possible to co-author with, which means that the average degree, if we normalize it by dividing by the number of editors, that becomes the edge density, which is another factor you can look at.
And that's in our table.
Thank you. So anyone has more questions? I double check. I don't have hands up. I see one. Yes.
Sue.
Sorry, sorry, I was just trying to find my unmute button. Just a quick question. Has any of the journals ever tried advertising for members of editorial boards as opposed to selecting them from people who are known? It's probably a very radical thing to do in many cases, and in tight fields like MSOM, as we were discussing, that might be very difficult, but I'd just be interested in people's reactions on that.
Well, it's certainly true that when they have an editor-in-chief search, you could volunteer yourself, right? Nobody has to nominate you. I used to be on the Informed Publication Committee and on several editor-in-chief search committees, and I don't think you have to, be nominated, right? You can just say, I would be interested in doing it. Now, I don't know about editorial boards, though.
Or to be reviewers, yes.
Yeah. Well, I have known people who said, I am interested in being a reviewer. If you know anyone who needs a reviewer, let me know, which I thought was wonderful, right?
Thank you.
So as I say, Laker and I are happy to email the paper to anyone who's interested. And anyone who wants to send us email, especially me, because Laker's starting at MIT, he has no more time for this. But anyone who wants to send me ideas for our next study, which is just starting with a different student, please do pass it along to me, because, it's a really great topic. And I would love to see our journal editorial boards be viewed by members as just inclusive and really excellent.
Yes,
Michael?
Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, I wanted to know, Margaret, have you had conversations with journal editors about their strategies for affirmatively reaching out to prospective members? My personal experience in service and informs is that many from underrepresented groups may feel shy or insufficiently qualified or experienced to do jobs that objectively were perfectly well prepared for, and therefore targeted outreach can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We didn't put that in our recommendations, but that's such a great recommendation, right? That editors should have more targeted outreach and really try to, find those people. So Greg Zarek recently took over as editor of Healthcare Management Science, not an Informs journal, but I talked to him about, he was going to restructure the whole editorial board, and he spent a lot of time being extremely deliberate about getting a really broad range of people, both demographically diverse, but also idea diverse. And of course, nothing is perfect. And as I mentioned, sometimes you need a person in a particular area and you just whoever can do it. But I think he probably did have some targeted outreach. Like he was really trying hard to bring in a lot of young, interesting people who could really grow and help make the journal amazing. But I don't know. So he's the only editor I've spoken to. So I don't know what other editors do. But good point, targeted outreach. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brando, for your time and for sharing the impact of your work with us today. Before everyone leaves, I want to invite you all to our last webinar series. It's going to happen in 2 weeks. We are going to have Christopher Carpenter and Dario Sanson talking about research on LGBTQIA+ issues. So make sure you register. This talk and previous talks are all available. This one is going to be available. The previous ones are already available on our website. So make sure you join for our last discussion on to increase awareness on DI research in ORMS. Thank you everyone for your time. Thank you again, Dr. Brando, for your time. Stay everyone safe and healthy, and hope to see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, Carolina.
Thank you.